Herd of horses surround a lonely crying boy on the road. What happens next is shocking. A herd of horses met a lonely, crying boy on the road, but what happened after that made all the locals burst into tears. A young boy named Charles sat on the desolate road, tears streaming down his dusty face. His clothes were worn and torn in places, and the cold wind stung his skin, deepening his sense of isolation. Surrounding him were endless fields, and with each passing minute, fear tightened around his chest. He called out for his parents, but his voice was swallowed by the silence of the evening. The wind rustled the grass, a reminder that night was quickly approaching. The road remained empty, and no one came to his aid. Charles was overwhelmed with confusion, unsure of what to do next. Then in the distance, he spotted a small herd of horses. At first, they appeared as mere dots on the horizon, but they quickly drew closer. The boy held his breath, hoping these magnificent creatures wouldn't harm him. His heart raced as their figures grew larger, approaching him with every passing second. Charles instinctively stepped aside, his fists clenched in fear and tension. But the horses slowed and approached him cautiously, their ears pricked and eyes focused on him. The air was still broken only by the sound of their steady breathing. One bay mare gently snorted before slowly stepping forward. Her big brown eyes looked calm and wise. As she came closer, she gently touched the boy with her soft nose. Charles held his breath, watching her every move. His fear slowly turned into curiosity. He reached out his hand and carefully stroked the mare's muzzle. His fingers glided over her smooth coat, allowing Charles to forget everything for a moment. Except for this magical instant, the horses surrounded Charles in a tight circle, protecting him from any possible danger. One of the horses softly neighed, and the sound echoed through the night, making Charles's heart beat even faster. The surprised boy stood in the center of this living circle, feeling, for the first time, a sense of protection he had never known before coming from these horses. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The cold penetrated his bones, and each breath became harder to take. The horses began to move, and although Charles was freezing, he followed them because he had nowhere else to go. His legs were shaking from exhaustion and cold, but he stubbornly kept walking. Charles stumbled over stones and roots, feeling exhausted and as if he couldn't take another step. The horses, sensing his weakness, slowed down and led him to a small, old barn surrounded by tall trees. He barely made it as dusk settled in. The barn creaked in the wind, and inside, the air was thick with the scent of old hay. Charles collapsed onto a pile of hay, his body finally relaxing as he curled up to get warm. The horses settled beside him, their breathing soothing him. Yet, the fear of being alone lingered, and he couldn't sleep, listening to every rustle in the dark. In the early morning, the sound of footsteps woke him, and his heart raced with anxiety. It was an elderly farmer named David White who had come to check on his horses. Seeing the small figure among the animals, he stopped in surprise. "What the heck?" David muttered, staring at the boy, who was peacefully sleeping on the hay next to the horses. The farmer carefully approached and bent over Charles, lightly touching him on the shoulder. Charles flinched, fear filling his eyes, but when he saw the kindness in David's gaze, he felt a sense of relief. Noticing Charles's trembling hands, David gently took his hand and reassured him. "It's okay, kid, you're safe now." Charles, still in disbelief, looked at him, but David's words were warm and sincere. David took Charles to his home, wrapped him in a blanket, and gave him hot soup. As Charles shared how his parents had abandoned him, David listened with sadness in his eyes, deciding then to care for the boy. The next morning, the farmer took Charles to the local clinic, where Dr. Amy Mitchell examined him and found that the boy was severely malnourished and suffering from infections caused by the poor care of his wounds. Charles gritted his teeth as the doctor treated his wounds, but he didn't make a sound. His face turned pale from the pain, but he held on, refusing to show any weakness. "He needs a lot of rest and good nutrition," Dr. Mitchell said seriously, looking at David. David nodded, assuring he would do everything for Charles. While Charles' eyes were clearer, traces of his past suffering remained. Over the next few weeks, Charles began to recover, growing especially attached to a bay mare named Star. Every morning, he would sit by her, watching her graceful movements, sometimes confiding in her about his fears. David noticed how much Charles connected with the horses and believed they would help him heal faster. Star's presence eased Charles' loneliness and nightmares. With the horses nearby, he found comfort and peace, his worries gradually fading away. The horses became more than just animals to Charles. They became his support in a world that had suddenly turned its back on him. Word of Charles quickly spread through the town, and many local residents began offering their help. The Allen family brought clothes, and Mrs. Wright, a former teacher, started working with Charles to help him catch up on his schoolwork. But even though he was surrounded by attention and care, Charles still sometimes woke up from nightmares where he was once again alone on that empty road, crying loudly. But no one came to help him. One night, the boy woke up with a scream, and David immediately rushed to him. The boy was sobbing, hiding under the blanket, and David sat next to him, put his arm around his shoulders, and whispered softly, "You're not alone anymore, Charles. I'm here with you." At that moment, Charles began to believe that kind man would never abandon him. However, their peaceful life was soon disrupted when Charles' real parents arrived at David's doorstep with a police officer. They looked exhausted, and Charles froze when he recognized them. Tears filled his eyes as his mother ran toward him, crying, "Charles, honey, we've been looking for you." His father stood beside her, wiping away tears. They explained to David and the officer that they had been forced to leave Charles on the road after losing their home and money. Desperate and regretful, they had hoped someone would care for him better than they could. Once their financial situation improved, they began searching for Charles. Charles stood between his parents and David, overwhelmed with a storm of emotions, relief, anger, and confusion. His heart was torn, as he still loved his parents but had found a new home with David and the horses, who had become his true friends. Just then, Star gently touched his shoulder, reminding him she would always be by his side. David, distrustful of Charles's parents for abandoning him, pushed for a custody case. In court, Charles spoke about how the horses found him, how David cared for him, and how the community had embraced him. His voice trembled as he described Star, explaining that she had saved him not just physically but emotionally, and he couldn't leave her. The boy looked straight at the judge, and in his eyes there was a determination to not let anyone take away what he had found with this kind farmer and his horses. The judge listened carefully and then decided to visit David's farm in person to see everything with her own eyes. When the judge arrived at the farm and saw Charles spending time with the horses, her heart softened. She watched as Star approached Charles, gently nudging him with her nose while he stroked her muzzle, a joyful smile on his face. It was a heartwarming sight, and the judge recognized the depth of their bond. The other horses stood around Charles, just as they had the first time on the road, forming a protective circle around the lonely boy. The animals seemed to sense that Charles was one of their own, and they kept anyone who might harm him at a distance. When the decision was announced in court, the judge ruled that Charles would stay with David, though his parents would be allowed regular visits. Charles felt a deep sense of happiness knowing he could remain with David and the horses while also being able to see his parents from time to time. Gradually, Charles' life began to settle. He lived with David on the farm, and although his parents visited regularly, they made an effort to stay involved in his life. With each passing day, Charles grew more confident and stronger. The nightmares became less frequent, and he found himself enjoying life on the farm more and more. As he sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing he had finally found his true home. What an incredible story! If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. See you in the next video.